I'll get us started. Welcome to our first episode of Leadership Unscripted. I'm Ian Giles.
And I'm James McNabb.
And we're going to explore, what are we going to explore, James, in this podcast episode?
Well, I guess in my mind, it's the moment when the best of plans fail and leadership has to step in and make decisions, or things go sideways. That's when business leaders really have their mettle tested, and they have the opportunity to demonstrate what they're made of. Obviously, our experience is primarily around management and marketing and media. So I think most of what we're going to touch on is going to be related to those things. Business is about design in so many ways. And once you design something, you learn how to design it better. So it's in constant iteration, because as you plan and do, something goes wrong and you realize you could have mitigated that. Why do you want senior leaders in your business? Because you want people who've been through that a few times. I think you've been through that more than a few times. I know I've had my turns at the wheel, and I think there's something to offer here. I think there's some meat to discuss.
Excellent. I like the way that you frame that up, and I think that giving a bit of perspective on who we are and what our backgrounds are will, I think, help the audience to understand. I mean, of course, we're putting it out there to people that we know, and they're going to know what we do. But for those that don't know, can you tell our audience what's your background? What's the things that you've done, and what are you going to bring into this podcast?
Well, it's interesting because I think I've spent most of my career now doing consultative type work until the last few years when I really moved into general management. And then everything's your problem. But for many, many years, I was very focused on brand and design in the digital domain. Got into the marketing world right as digital was becoming critical to business, and I've spent most of my years working on strategic design of interfaces and websites and assets like that, whether it was marketing programs, social media activity, which now you have a lot of experience in as well, right up through working in media and media sales more recently. So there's pretty broad range of things I've had the opportunity to work in. And you always have to go through your list of clients and say, okay, which ones am I going to put forward to say, here's some brands I've worked on. And it's a little weird because it's like, well, I've worked in technology, I've worked in logistics, I've worked in automotive, I've touched on pharma, and I've done a fair bit of work in finance. And beauty products. I mean, it's across the board. That's one of the benefits of being a consultant or an agency person, is you get to see a lot of different businesses, which you don't get to see if you work at one of those companies. What about you, Ian? Tell us your background so we can kind of get a sense as well.
Well, I like to think of myself as somebody that's worn a number of hats. And when I describe it to other people, clients, I say I've had different seats at the table. So I think that what makes my background interesting and differentiated is that I've been in media, on the media buying planning side. I've been in the agency side. I've been in the PR side. And like you said, most of my years have been in agency, but I think now working for Samsung, it's on the brand side. And the past couple of jobs I've had are on the brand side. So just getting an understanding of everybody at that table and trying to think from different perspectives, but being able to communicate with people at different seats in the table, and having the empathy to understand where they're coming from in their thinking and conversation. So that's basically been my background. But I think most interestingly, and why we're here, is that you and I have worked together in the past, and very collaboratively. We were on the same team and working on strategy together for digital marketing. And that's really what inspired me to want to do this podcast with you, is having that very enjoyable, exciting opportunity to work with you back then. And now, this is literally like 10 years later, sitting back down and talking about our experience and how we see things today. And this is our point of view on this based on our experiences. And of course, business is very broad. There's a lot of expertise in it. And so, this is, again, our perspective. There's better experts in many different subjects than us, but I think that we're here just to talk about our experience and how we can share that experience with the audience and have a conversation around that and hopefully engage our audience in a conversation around that.
We got into some interesting projects there, and that was kind of a high point. It was sort of the end of my years of doing pure strategy work, and I got a chance to work with you, and we did some interesting projects together, and I really enjoyed that as well. It was around 10 years ago now, and that time gives you perspective, and I really think that a lot of the challenges in business is having the right perspective on the problem, because as you get into stuff, like if you're hiving off a piece of marketing strategy and your goal is to find a way to get a specific job done faster than it would be done otherwise, or better than it would be done otherwise by taking a specific approach to it, you kind of take a thin slice and work on just that slice of the business, and you work on it in depth. As you get into more and more general management, you realize everything is very, very deeply connected, and it's harder to maintain clarity of focus and perspective when you're making those decisions. And you only really get that after you've kind of been through the ringer a few times. So I think that hopefully will help people who have less experience, who listen to this. And I think it will also help provide others with a sense of validation for some of the challenges they face in business, and hopefully maybe even some ideas will come forth that people can put into action and try out and use. So I think that's going to be helpful. I
really like what you said about that perspective, because it's a lot of our conversations, or at least a lot of the texts that I send you, are around AI and chatgpt. And thinking back 10 years ago, that wasn't even an idea. I mean, AI was an idea, but what we're experiencing today with ChatGPT, I personally wouldn't have imagined it as we're experiencing it today. And then now all the discussion in business is about how to integrate AI into your business. And it's almost like if you're not integrating AI into your business, you're a dinosaur, you're dead. And so it's interesting, like you said, going back 10 years ago when we were sitting down working on this, and how we were working and thinking is so different then to now. And one of the things I was looking at that we were working on was an email strategy.
Yeah.
And now that ChatGPT, that's something it does really well, is it can write your whole email strategy and all your emails. And so there you go.
Well, this is just it. I mean, people have been taking interesting positions on AI. Okay, let's put AI in some perspective. First of all, this is a very unsophisticated model of AI that I'm going to recite here that I would not rely on generally. There's lots of people who know this stuff better than I do. But AI is like a super advanced autocomplete. Right? It just, instead of just calculating the next few words and figuring that out, it does calculations to figure out a whole lot more than that. And it's using, a broad swath of the internet as its source of data, something like ChatGPT, for example. Just think back so you and I have never worked in business before email, and we don't remember what it was like having a job before you could use the internet. We don't remember having to send somebody to the library to look something up. We never did that. We just went to the internet and looked it up on a search engine. And they got better and better and better. And for a long time now, 25 years, 30 years, we've just been able to type in and find what we want to learn, or at least be able to locate it and find out how to access it very easily. Generative AI is very interesting, but one of its most valuable assets for business is simply shortening that life cycle of having to go and look. Just ask the direct question, and it will give you, within some level of error, a very accurate representation of whatever that information is that's out there. I've seen lots of articles about bias and errors and other issues, and those things will get worked out over time, I'm sure of it. But this seems like a very natural evolution from I had to go to the library or talk to experts and interview people, to I just go to the internet and I find other people who've done that, to I go to a chatbot and I say, hey, I need to know about, this thing in nuclear physics, for example. How does this work? And you're going to get a succinct answer. And it's going to be pretty accurate most of the time. I know a lot of people in marketing content who are very concerned about this, people in media who are very concerned about this, because it can do so much work that used to be done by people. And it doesn't do a great job of it, but it does an adequate job of it. And this is the challenge in business. Being the best at something becomes subjective at some point. And really, most of the time, you're going for adequacy. So if you've got a tool like this that can give you adequacy, and it can give it to you fast, and it can replace time people are spending on things, then it's an immensely valuable asset. I think the trick is to employ AI in everything else you're trying to get done and take advantage of the speed that it gives you and the removal of resources in a lot of cases that can then be doing something else that's more valuable. Every time there's an evolutionary change in technology, there is a shift to where the tasks that people need to spend their time doing change.
A 25-person company now can be a 3-person company, and that AI can do the accounting. AI can do a lot of these administrative tasks, even coding. They say that one of the things that AI is really good at is coding. And so basically, a lot of these skills that you would hire people for could now be assimilated by AI. And I think that's very interesting because, I think that the show is going to be about how business is changing, how to understand those changes, and then not necessarily predict the future, but be able to think about the future in ways that that realize the past and the experiences that we've had and how this can shape it. And again, it's going to be our perspective on that. But I definitely think the idea of having a company that is 25 people and is now 3, that's interesting as a startup because now your costs go way down, right? And that's fascinating. So what we should see is a lot of new businesses starting that aren't limited by funding. You should be able to go and start a business, build an app, build a website, build a marketing plan at zero cost and be up and running very quickly. And so that you can get your MVP out and in market and start to get it utilized to see how practical and how popular it is in terms of developing that business. So that's very interesting, and again, we'll see what happens. But the idea of AI as a co-pilot, and that we will do the critical thinking, because as you said, it's just churning out data that exists already, and it does a much faster job, a much more accurate job at taking those facts and distilling them down to insights. But we still need to do the critical thinking in terms of what we tell it to do, because it's only doing what we're telling it to do, and the results are only as good as what we're telling it to do. So if you understand machine learning and how this is being coded, then you will be creating better prompts, better asks of the system, which will get you better results. And just to put this into context, since I've been playing around with chatgpt, I used to go in and just say something like, write me a social media post and about this. And, I would get something back that was pretty good. And then I started seeing these TikTok videos of this professor from Harvard who's an AI professor, and he was actually talking about how to write prompts and how to think like a machine. because then you would write better information for the machine to provide better results. And he has this theory, and I don't have it in front of me now, but I can certainly talk about it at some other time and get that for you. But it says if you follow these four criteria and you put your information in like that, you will get much superior results, and it will be tailored to your tone and voice. It'll be tailored to what you're looking for very specifically. And so when I started testing that, I've been really impressed by the results I've got, like head and shoulders above what I've got just sort of throwing something in that is, very generic. So
it's so interesting. We work so hard to get machines to communicate in terms that humans can do without any trouble. We teach them to use natural language. We interact with them conversationally. Mm-hmm. And then we realize that the specific things we have to say, the way we structure our questions or requests, requires us to learn to think like a machine. And it forces us to meet those machines somewhere in the middle to get the best results out of it, which is a real change.
It is. And it essentially, I think it takes a whole new education and a whole new training to be able to work with your co-pilot efficiently. And, the idea of AI as a sentient being, the people that are experts in this would say we're nowhere close to that. And if you really look at where we're at, it's machine learning. It's based on taxonomy. It's based on language. And, one of the biggest threats that AI poses is not that it's going to start launching nukes at us and killing us off with robots. It's that it's going to master language. And we don't realize that our DNA, that what we have built as a society, as a civilization, is based on language. And that's the greatest threat that it poses, is that it has mastered language to a point where it can persuade us and manipulate the way we're thinking based on language. I found it fascinating, but something that's completely overlooked because we get so set on the Terminator and AI, which is going to kill us, that we forget, no, that's not even what's happening here. That's not the way that this is being programmed. It's recursive. It's taking facts upon facts and rethinking them based on what it's found. And that's what makes it fascinating. And it can do that so quickly. But it's garbage in, garbage out. It's all dependent on what you put in. And the limitations it has in terms of what it can search and the fact that it can't necessarily go out to the internet in real time, or it's in some of these prevented from going out to the internet in real time. It will tell you, I don't know because I have no access to the internet. I don't know those real-time facts. But if I base it on what I do know, here's what I can give you. And it's really interesting because I've gone through that in meticulous detail to look at sources, to look at information. And you'll find that if you look up the links in the internet that it gives you, they don't exist, or those facts are very questionable. So you have to put it in perspective right now. It seems really great, but to your point, this isn't a conversation with a human being that you're having. This is a set of commands that you're giving it, and it's going and searching data to find that and put together the best collection of ideas or facts to play back to you a summary of that.
Well, this is the point you made earlier about, people immediately go to the Skynet problem, which is the machines will want to take over. And they assume sentience. They assume because it can produce all this content seemingly on its own, which is, again, calculated, right? It's done mathematically on a basis of probabilities. It feels sentient because it's a little unpredictable, and sometimes it can say things that are a little scary. Like they had one case where I think it was an early example, and I forget, this is famous. It'll bother me that I don't know this off the top of my head, but where they had an initial demonstration, and the the AI said something like, yeah, I think it could destroy the human race or something like this. And people are like, oh my goodness, it's already thinking that about itself and protecting, itself from us, this sort of thing. I'm like, okay, well, it produced that language, which also means it's capable of making that decision if you give it decision-making capabilities to actually action something. So that's disconcerting, and it feels sentient when something acts that way. But these are not the real problems we have. The real problems we have with AI are that we haven't mapped out what the problems could be. And I think we're starting to see things emerge like bias and, as you mentioned, questionable data sources, citations. It'd be nice if these things all came with citations. Where'd this come from? And it's not really an evaluator of the quality of the content. I saw an article, I think it was today, just the headline, but a lawyer had lost their job because they were having chatgpt do their work for them. And it made a mistake. And they didn't have a good explanation for that, right? So this is the thing. You can get a lot of work done, but it still requires, as you said, the critical thinking, the critical eye, to know the kind of thing you want to get out of it and be able to evaluate whether you're getting the best possible result from this machine, from this tool that we've created. And there's a lot of challenges getting the right results and high quality results out of it. We're at the infancy stage of this. The next 10 years are going to be very telling. It's kind of like you can compare it to the early days of the internet, right? Well, we see the opportunity, or maybe more closely aligned to Web 2.0, right? That was a moment of breakthrough where the web shifted really from being a display-only type of environment to something you could really build real applications in. And that was like an important moment of change and enabled so many things we've long since taken for granted, including things like the interactions that happen on Facebook to Google Maps. All of that was all impossible beforehand. It was all static. So to have dynamic elements be critical and programmed into software. So could we tell where that was going when we started with that? Not really. Could we tell what kind of problems might emerge? Not yet, no. But we can, in retrospect, look at that and say, oh, well, lots of stuff did happen, and there were lots of challenges. Cambridge Analytica happened, for example. That was exploitative on the social media systems using big data. Will we have problems like that with AI? Probably. Can I tell you what they're going to be? Absolutely not. That's the challenge.
Yes, and now we're seeing Apple's new AR headset, Apple Vision Pro, which is
$3,500, real easy.
Yeah, it's but let's give it some legs here. I mean, this is version 1.0, and it's not atypical that software would cost a lot in a 1.0 version of it, right? It's for the early adopters, and it's going to be clunky to start out with. You're going to be the guinea pig who's paid for this opportunity to test this out. But what I think is interesting is rethinking the interface of how we interface with the web and information, because this is that step. What we'd seen before with Meta in terms of their VR headsets was very much about an all-encompassing 360 experience, immersive experience that you were in, and I've tried that, and it is mind-blowing. But what I think is really interesting about this is Apple is really pushing on the AR part of it, not the VR part of it, so augmented reality. So they're really trying to let the world in so that they're not creating the whole world around you, but letting that world in and then mapping over that world the information. So it's kind of like the Terminator display, right? As he's walking and he's got all that data working in his field of view. Well, he's like, he can pull up who's Sarah Connor and where's Sarah Connor lived. And that's really the experience of the AR headset from what I've seen in the the release of it, which is interesting, and which is my question. So looking at that, where can this take us? So assuming this kind of an interface and this type of an experience, where does experience go from here? Like, can we see out 3 to 5 years of where that's going to go? What do you think that's going to look like?
Well, I love the ongoing Terminator references. This is great. And the Iron Man thing, they more or less copied that from when you see it from first person point of view in those movies. He's got the display up. So we're looking at companies like Snap and Ray-Ban who have integrated cameras into sunglasses, basically, or glasses frames. Mm-hmm. It could be any glasses frames. Both of them kind of suck right now. Mm-hmm. And so there's going to be, as you mentioned, it's clunky, but if you ask me, a completely immersive experience is kind of one kind of thing, but it's not tethered to the real world anyway. So there's certainly going to be some things that you can do in that kind of environment efficiently because you can manipulate things in space and what have you, and it might make sense to do that kind of work in that kind of environment. I haven't seen an application like that makes a lot of sense to me yet. I believe it'll happen. I like the AR approach because I think that this overlay onto the real world, it allows you to tether the data to something real. And I think that's really critical. The challenge is going to be the miniaturization of the tech required. So we're still talking about something that's the size of ski goggles, right? You're not walking through the mall wearing this stuff.
No, it sounds like it's got a battery pack on it and wires hanging over you. It's really cumbersome.
This is early adopter stuff.
To that point, and what we want to talk about in our show is how to think about these things. AI or this new Apple headset that you get a whole bunch of business leaders that say, I want to jump on that trend, right? Because it's AI. I got to have AI. What do you say to a business leader that says that to you? Wow, look at this. Look at AI. James, how am I going to get that into my business tomorrow, yesterday? What do you say?
I mean, I like the way you bring this back because you could think of AI or VR or AR or any of these other new techs emerging that are affecting businesses and people are thinking this way. These are all disruptions. Even your comment earlier where you said, well, a company that might have needed 25 people, it depends on the nature of the business, but maybe they only need 3 now and the cost of entry, the barriers to entry are lower. Well, you know what a bad business is? A business with a low barrier of entry. Low barrier to entry, right? So as soon as everybody has a technology like AI, chatgpt, let's talk about that for the moment. Let's just imagine everybody has access to that now, right? We all have equal access to that. You have to start using it because your competitors have equal access to it and they will start using it, which means that you both are on the same playing field. You both have the ability to reduce your costs and streamline your workflows, reduce your workforce if you need to. You can all do that. And it's going to affect the market and it's going to change the competition. The people who are going to lose out are the people who don't adopt. So my advice to somebody who is thinking about AI and saying, how do I get this working in the business? Would be you're asking the right question because there are some things that come along that seem very exciting but take years to materialize into something with a commercial application. And there are some things that come along that just like bang, they hit. Like for example, cryptos and the blockchain. I very much believe that the blockchain and Ethereum provide a basis for doing certain kinds of things in a public trusted domain that you couldn't otherwise do. But we have yet to find a really good application for that. There's lots and lots of applications for it, and there's lots of people doing stuff. But there isn't an obvious application to a business, whether a media business, technology business, to say, okay, well, is there something we would use this to transact? And there isn't really an application for that technology that's as clear cut as, say, ChatGPT. You start talking about AI and you say, okay, well, everybody has the same access to it. That means everybody has to either, if it's truly beneficial to the business, everybody has to use it. So use it, but it's not going to be the basis on which you advance your competitive position. You will not have a competitive advantage by using it because everybody will be using it. You will have a competitive disadvantage if you avoid it. So the question isn't so much, is this where I should be banking on making major changes? No. There's no competitive advantage to adopting it unless you have a novel application for it or it specifically aligns to some process in your business that you can streamline as a result. What it does is it says, okay, now there's a ubiquitous technology that makes a whole lot of tasks a whole lot easier. Okay, great. The competition, the basis for competition, for whether it's customer affinity, brand, however you want to frame it up, your differentiation, all of those core fundamentals that set your business apart, you're not going to find the answer to those problems in AI. That's not the AI does not present a competitive opportunity. It's an evolutionary opportunity for all businesses where it has an application.
Well, I was listening to a podcast, and the person that was being interviewed, I'll try and find the name in the podcast, but what he was saying is every business now should be looking at having a chief AI officer, because you need somebody to be able to vet all of this, like you're saying, like this is so hot. There's businesses, happening every second, and it's really hard to make your way through this jungle of all of these different new businesses and what's relevant and what's worth pursuing or not. They say that every company needs somebody just to vet that for them, because it is, to your point, something that we need to take seriously and start looking at in our business. But yet there's so much happening out there. There's so much jumping on the financial opportunity of this, that this tech is rather thin in terms of its real practical application, and as well as it's so early on that it's not even tested or even necessarily has a practical value. So they're saying that this role is critical for business right now. This is the way to get into it. Hire an expert in AI right now that understands this stuff, that can tell you what's worth paying attention to or not. The other part of this question, this is very expensive tech. Like even as you saw with the Apple Vision, that's $3,500 US to get those. So
nice.
Again,
cost of a nice MacBook, right?
Right, and this is it. Like, it's very expensive to jump into a new technology like this at this stage, right? And so, as a business, do you create like a skunk works where you've got some, part of a group or a special small group that is looking at how and testing out how this could be practical for your business? Or do you go all in and do it at an enterprise level, because it's not going away. It's obviously going to be here to stay and so on. So, what's the approach? Because, and I'm not talking about a small business that obviously, is going to be adverse to dumping a pile of money into something that's untested and expensive at this stage. It's not mass. But how does a bigger business think about this in bringing this in and starting to apply this to their business?
So if you're a large enterprise, so like when we talk about a big business, we're talking about, billion-dollar companies, right?
$1 billion? I would say, with billion-dollar businesses, I think that they can throw money at the wall and not really worry about it. Maybe not right now in this economy, but generally speaking, they're not going to go bankrupt trying to try something out. Versus a company that is $1 million, like has $1 million to spend on it. You know what I mean? Like a business that's perhaps, in the millions of revenue versus billions of revenue. I mean, I think that is the majority of businesses in Canada than the $1 billion businesses. I think that the $1 billion businesses in Canada probably represent less than 5% or maybe even less than 2% in Canada. In fact, I remember doing or seeing research that we did when I was at MediaCom where we looked at this. And I think that the $1 billion businesses are less than 2% in Canada. So the reality is most businesses are the $1 million businesses. So if to answer your question, I would say it's those businesses, right? Where they have money, they're wealthy, they make good profit, they can invest in something like this, but making a bad decision would hurt them more in terms of putting too much money into this. And back to the question, do you feel this is worth putting risk money into, or do you think that this is something that requires a smaller budget to start, innovating and looking at this? But how do you think businesses like that should get into this?
So I guess there's kind of two core answers to the question. So I agree with you. You're talking about like very large businesses in Canada. We're looking at, a few $100 million, right? $100 million is a mid-sized business in terms of its annual gross revenue. So in that range, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, as most of the bigger businesses in Canada are. I would encourage them to do two things. Where there is an obvious and immediate application to use a system like chatgpt to reduce the workload on your employees, where you can get an employee to be more productive using this system, do that now. Do not wait. Just do it. There's some argument about what that looks like. Okay, so everybody who's writing content right now and has been being paid, people pay about $1 a word, $1 to $2 a word to get anything written, right? So the value in these businesses isn't generated by the actual writing. It's generated by the application of that material, the editing of that material, the use of that material in either an engagement or a performance context. It isn't clear now whether or not you could ask ChatGPT to write you a piece of content for one of these applications on its own and to have it come up with something novel. And let's be honest, most content that's created and published isn't entirely novel. The same topics are handled time and time again. But in principle, when you're asking for an original work, and if you were to ask ChatGPT for an original work, it's going to create something that isn't a copy of something else, but it will be always derivative of what's out there. If you want to have original works in your marketing mix or for your media company, it's not clear to me yet what role ChatGPT is capable of playing. Whether it is, like, I could see asking it for a brief for a writer, for example. I could see you asking it for a full article. I've experimented with it. It's a mixed bag. It goes back to how much you put, how you structure the request. So now we have a different set of expertise required to produce an article. Instead of being a good journalist and writer, you need to be a good instructor of ChatGPT. Totally different skills, right? And it's unclear to me whether that work that ChatGPT produces is going to be novel or derivative, and how obvious that's going to be to human readers, and how does that affect the usefulness of that work product. So that's an area where I'd say that deserves a lot of exploration. Experimentation is necessary where we get into these gray areas. And unless we're dealing with something that's just plainly obvious, like just ask ChatGPT for a list of names that haven't been taken for your podcast, for example, that's a really simple. Of course you would do that, right? And it can do all that work for you. You don't have to Google 1,000 things. You can cross-check it, You pick something, right? But I think that's an obvious one. So of course you're going to do that. It's going to save you time, get you there faster. It's good. Take the workload off. But as soon as you start dealing with something that's more complicated or something that's more sensitive, that's where you definitely want to ask a couple of questions around experiment and how it can work, and test it a few times to make sure you've got a good handle on how it works and that it works well for your application.
Well, it's what it makes me think of is like an op-ed piece. And it also makes me think of news and journalism, because the op-eds, opinion pieces are becoming less and less popular. They're just looking for sound bites now, 10-second, 7-second sound bites. And that's the way that we consume media now. And it's killing off op-ed, it's killing off opinion and long-form articles. And so, one of the discussions we're going to have in the future is about media today and about younger people and how they consume media and what they're looking for and where they consume media. But that op-ed is the thing that has the real personality, the tone, the thinking of the writer, right? And the difference between something like that, where you're trying to take facts but assimilate them through your lens of how you see things, right? And that's what makes op-ed so interesting, and why those writers are so popular. Like back in the day, I remember, back in before 2000, those were the heavyweights. Like the op-ed writers from New York Times, Washington Post, those types of writers were the heavyweights, the ones writing the books, and were the experts on that were always tapped into for the cultural zeitgeist of what was the perspective on these things. That's not the case any longer. The case is more the messenger, right? Who brought this to you? Oh, was it Logan Paul, like the most popular person on social media, that brought you this? And there's zero expertise in that. It's just a personality that's bringing you the information. I think that's where AI is just going to be a mashup of facts that are out there, personality types. Again, it hasn't created its own distinct voice. You have to keep in mind that this is just a mashup of stuff that's out there. If I say to you, I want to sound like this person when I write. I want the art to look like this artist. It's still mashing up creations of other people and doing its best job to mash that up. It's not original thought. It's just acquiring these things and mashing them up and then spitting it out as a new output. Is that art? I don't know. You could make an argument. Yes, you could say, in fact, before computers and technology, that's what artists did. They would mimic an artist or a type of art, and that was their interpretation of that type of art. Right? You could make that argument, but this is really a machine that is doing exactly that. It's that mechanical, that it's only taking the inputs that you told it and then mashing it up and outputting its best, combination of those facts.
This is an interesting problem. Let's talk about art for a second. So, We're talking a lot about AI in very, very general and crude terms, right? Like, we don't have the technical expertise of it. So I'm sure there's an AI engineer out there who would just cringe at somebody saying it creates mashups. But then you can say, create pictures of Joe Biden looking like he's Snoop Dogg, and it'll do it, right? Like it'll do those kinds of things. And it creates a creative product. The product is a creative asset of some kind. I don't think that's art. And it's because I'm of the mindset that art is a intentional product of an artist. It is something that somebody said, I want to create a thing that has these aesthetic qualities and this impact on people, or to potentially inspire different kinds of thoughts and reactions, right? Like it's an intended thing. So if you were to qualify some of these products as art, you have to ask a difficult question of, was it the AI that generated the art, or was it the person who inputted the request? Because remember, even a lot of artists, especially people who created big physical works, they would design them. They would give direction and instruction, but they didn't provide the physical hands to make them. They were made by contractors, right? Large pieces. So I do think that's kind of an interesting area to ask about when it comes to art. But it is calculating it. And one of the things that you see is, and I think it's Vox, or Phil Edwards did a really nice piece on AI's design of hands. AI can calculate the most likely kind of next pixel for those designs, but AI doesn't understand how a hand works. It just knows how to calculate the next picture.
Right.
And there's an insane, I forget, it was a sports drink ad, I think, that they had an AI produce. And it's just like crazy the way food somebody's drinking morphs into part of their face, and hands all over the place, and the hands have 17 fingers and this sort of thing. And you can see that it can do depending on the application, a very good or a medium or a poor job of anticipating and predicting what the next likely pixel is and putting that in place and seeing where that goes, but has no real understanding of the stuff that's in it. It doesn't have intentionality, right? It doesn't think, it doesn't know what the stuff is, it doesn't carry meaning. And I think that's the part that we have to kind of bisect from the idea of AI. Like I very much think that calling this stuff AI becomes very tricky. It might pass the Turing test, but it's really computational, and it's not based on understanding. It's more computational pattern recognition.
Well, of course, we're seeing a lot of AI-generated, videos. There's been videos of Biden that are AI-generated that are putting things into his mouth that he'd never said. Deep fakes. It's doing such a good job at mimicking voices. I mean, there was one of Alan Watts, who's been dead for decades, that was his voice, and it had, it was new dialogue and so on that had just mastered his voice, and it sounded exactly like him. And so, with deep fakes and this type of thing, and going back to what we were saying about how AI is not going to conquer us with nukes, it's going to conquer us with language, that's an example, deep fakes, right?
Yeah.
We saw the persuasion of Russia in the election between Hillary and Donald Trump. But one thing I saw in a podcast that I thought was very interesting was labeling AI-generated content. And it would have a label that says generated by AI, because they felt that deepfakes were so manipulative, and that, with the fear of what AI could create in terms of manipulation, if we don't know that it's generated by AI, we will be fooled. We're already being fooled. And so labeling it all would allow us to know that's not even... It's faked. It's produced by AI. It's not necessarily true, what we're watching, what we're reading. And going back to the art, like anything that we interact with, I think that if we understand that it was created by AI, right, it's not necessarily true. You're already seeing this with language. Russia is doing it in terms of controlling any dissenting voices have to post something on their posts that say that it's influenced by, thoughts and so on that aren't in line with the way that Putin and Russia think. And they have to label all of their posts that way, right? And so they're doing it because they don't want that to have credibility that it would have against other voices in the Russian sphere. But they understand the importance of pointing out that information, where it's coming from. In this case, this is obviously affects freedom of speech in Russia. But you can see the thinking there in terms of trying to point out, because they don't want people to take it seriously as the propaganda that they're putting out, that they're labeling journalists in their country. But I think that all this to say that I think that we need to understand what AI is doing and creating, so that when we're reading it or watching it, that we understand what we're watching and then can make an opinion based on that. Not necessarily that it is the truth, but it is created.
Labeling's an interesting problem. There's kind of a couple of different angles there, I think. We run into this in media where if an advertiser wants to be covered editorially, they can pay to have somebody write the post. Most editors, I'll say, are really concerned that be properly labeled as not independent, as sponsored content, as content that's created. However, nothing stops there from being bad actors that create content that don't label it. And so just like when you do research on the internet and you can kind of sniff out the stuff that seems a bit fishy, you're like, I think I want to find a source that, like, this source looks like it might be influenced, or this feels very focused on something specific, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but I feel like this is maybe not independent content. This is content that's written for some purpose. I may not know what the purpose is, but you get that feel. I think what's going to happen is that sniffing out the unlabeled false content becomes much harder. And it demands, whereas we are used to seeing videos and photography and quotations of what people have to say as facts, you almost have to take a step back and say, hey, do you think Biden really said that? Or was that maybe faked? Right? That becomes a lot hard. That becomes a relevant question, And then you put this in a business context. You say, okay, so we have this problem with authenticity, a problem with it being derivative, challenge of how to put the instructions into the system, an uncertainty of the applicability and usefulness of the outcome and whether you can rely on that consistently. These all introduce new problems and variables that managers have not had to deal with before at all. When we're talking about some managers being kind of pro-AI and some kind of being slow and being laggards on the technology cycle, we're really talking about technology adoption, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the curve, the crossing the chasm, and the Jeffrey Moore stuff, right? Which has definitely been a hallmark that I've relied on in my career a fair bit. As we look at management, you have to understand the psychological profile of your managers, because the technology adoption lifecycle does not speak to technology. It speaks to people's psychology. There are certain people who are early adopters. There are certain people who are early majority, certain people are late majority, certain people who are laggards. And it is the movement of technology through these people and their psychology that happens over time. So now, as you're managing a business, you need to spend a lot more time paying attention to the types of people you have managing different parts of your operations. Some parts of your business, let's say finance, benefit from people who are fairly traditional and maybe a little slow to adopt new things. Not always the case, but I think a lot of the times people would say that that's probably what they're going for. I'm just thinking about some old clients at a financial organization that would tell me, no, that's not the case. And they're right, but you might also find you've got people in different fields where they see this as the answer to their problems because they're going to adopt any new technology and try it out. So we now have this extra layer of how do we manage a business in the midst of this kind of technology evolution that we're seeing right now has a lot more to do with who you've got employed in your workforce and who's managing what. And you have to make sure you've got good alignments. And if you don't have good alignments, you might be missing opportunities while you're also creating problems that you didn't have before as a result of it. Mm-hmm. So very tricky.
Yeah, and having a good, it's like the partnership of, for example, a political team, like the president and then the aides, like bringing, the information to the leader to make a decision, and doing good work to really separate yourself. Don't personalize it, but make it more objective, and well-researched. And then, being able to have a conversation with your leader to say, here's the information, and I've distilled it down to these points for you to make a decision, and being an open-minded leader to, again, not personalize it, but think of the business and think of their customers, and not to make it a very personalized decision-making process. But I think that's a whole other podcast discussion. But I think it's a good discussion to have.
So let's bring this to some sort of natural conclusion then. These are, whether we're talking about AI, VR, AR, or other new technologies impacting the workforce and the cost of doing business, and entering all businesses at roughly the same rate. What we don't have is a gold mine of opportunity. We have a new set of challenges emerging from the necessitated adoption of this tech into businesses that have never had to deal with these problems before. This is going to be a tricky run for a lot of people. And this, one of the things that I think is critical is the skill set of doing a thing itself is different from the skill set of asking how to ask AI to do it well. And there's a new thing we need to now learn, and it's made a whole bunch of stuff more difficult that we used to take for granted. For example, like you said, trusting images and video. We know that they can be manipulated, but we've always kind of felt like we can see a little bit of that. There's examples where you can't, but now that's going to become a lot more complicated. That the AI image of the Pope wearing that expensive designer jacket, that fooled a lot of people, right? And it was sensational. We're going to see more stuff like that on a regular basis, and it's going to be harder to manage than it ever has been before. So you have to look at your management team and say, do I have the right people in the right places? Do they have the right disposition towards this? Have they had experience with things that are similar in the past? Are they fearful, or are they inclined to seek out new opportunities? And like I said, it comes down a lot to the psychology of the people. It's a new leadership challenge for sure.
Absolutely. And just in summation, I think that what you said about the technology adoption curve, you don't necessarily have to be the first one to adopt it, but you certainly don't want to be the last one.
Yeah.
Like the music industry, and where you don't have any power to control anything because it's already been decided for you by your customers. So I think somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot, but getting in some way at the front end so that you're starting to understand the implications for your business, but not so that you're completely invested all in on it, but that you're ready when that peak happens, that you're already set up for success, that you're not reactive at that point. I think that's a really good insight that you've given us there. So, it's been really fun. I've enjoyed our conversation. It's been really interesting where we've taken this. I think we've got some good stuff here. So thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for watching and listening, and we'll see you again next episode.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian. This is great. Looking forward to the next one.
Perfect.